Rwanda, we shall wipe our tears with one hand and build with another. The continent of Africa has 54 countries, and Rwanda is one of the top few that stand out despite having a haunted past. The easiest way to prove this is to look at some of its indicators in comparison to other countries. For every 100,000 residents, Rwanda has 2.6 murders per year. As a comparison, that is lower than America's 6.3 or South Africa's 36.4. It's even more impressive if you compare this to its neighbors within the East African Community Bloc. Burundi has 6.1, Tanzania has 6.5, Uganda has 10.2, and DRC has 10.5. Rwanda ranks as the 52nd least corrupt country in the world. That's not perfect, but on the African continent, it ranks among the top 5 least corrupt countries. Only Mauritius, Botswana, Cape Verde, and Seychelles, far richer countries, rank higher. Rwanda ranks as the 38th easiest place to do business in globally, not too impressive, but on the African continent, it ranks second only after Mauritius. Rwanda has a life expectancy of 67.8 years, which is slightly below the world average of 73. That's not impressive at all, but what is impressive is that 28 years ago, the life expectancy of Rwanda was only 29 years. But life in Rwanda hasn't always been this way. "28 years ago, Rwanda faced one of the worst genocides in human history. On 6 April 1994, an aircraft carrying Rwandan Hutu President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down with a surface-to-air missile near Kigali, the capital. The assassination of President Habyarimana catalyzed a genocide, and the following day, Hutu militias began to execute the Tutsi. Neighbors killed neighbors, some husbands killed their Tutsi wives, some priests and nuns also killed people who sought shelter in churches. At the time in Rwanda, identity cards had people's tribes, so Hutu militias set up roadblocks where Tutsi were identified and slaughtered with machetes. Weapons and hit lists were handed out to local groups who knew exactly where to find their targets. The scale of the genocide caused shock worldwide, but no country intervened to stop the genocide. The French, who were allies of the Hutu government, sent special forces to evacuate their citizens, but not do enough to stop the killing of the Tutsi. Hutu militias targeted the Tutsi with rifles, machetes, and in a period of 100 days, Rwanda lost over 1 million lives, and 75% of the Tutsi population was wiped out. This became the quickest massacre in human history after Hiroshima. RPF, a Tutsi-dominated rebel group led by Paul Kagame, attacked from the north, advancing towards Kigali. With the support of the Ugandan government, RPF advanced steadily south, and Kagame was recruiting heavily to expand the army. The recruits included Tutsi survivors of the genocide and refugees from Burundi. By June of 1994, RPF had encircled Kigali, forcing the interim government out of the capital. And on 4th of July of 1994, RPF defeated the Rwandan forces, and on 18th of July took the rest of the northwest, forcing the interim government to flee to Zaire. Liberation Day of Rwanda would come to be marked as 4th of July and is commemorated as a public holiday each and every year. After the RPF ended the genocide, Pastor Bizimungu became the president of Rwanda and Paul Kagame became the vice president. In 2000, Pastor Bizimungu resigned over a dispute and Paul Kagame became the president of Rwanda till today. Paul Kagame was determined to build Rwanda from the shambles all the way up to make it the Singapore of Africa. At the time, Rwanda had a GDP per capita of $220, making it one of the poorest countries in the world, a number that has grown to $824 to date. 80% of Rwandans were living in poverty, infrastructure was completely destroyed, and with a public debt of $1.5 billion, larger than its GDP of $1.3 billion at the time. But a determined Paul Kagame told fellow countrymen and women, quote, "We shall wipe our tears with one hand and build with another." His vision was to build Rwanda and make it into the Singapore of Africa. To understand this statement, we have to understand what Singapore is today and also learn the similarities that the two countries share in history. Singapore sits on top of all the indicators, not just in Asia but in the entire world. It is the second richest country in the world, it is the second easiest country to do business in the world, and it's the fourth least corrupt country in the world. It's one of the best cities to live in Asia, with high quality of living, world-class infrastructure, best healthcare services, a leader in high-tech manufacturing, a financial and logistical hub of all of Southeast Asia. But it has not always been this way. On 9th of August 1965, a newly created Malaysia did something that other nations never do. It voluntarily ejected a strategic and important part of its own land, a 733 square kilometer island known as Singapore. This was due to deep political and economic differences between the ruling parties of Singapore and Malaysia. This led to racial riots, and at a press conference announcing the separation, Singaporean Prime Minister at the time, Kuan Yew, broke down in tears. Singapore was already in a terrible position prior to its independence. 2/3 of its population lived in slums, with many addicted to opium. Its highly mixed population was increasingly breaking out into violence. It had no significant industry or natural resources, and unemployment was very high. Its larger and more powerful neighbors not only were going to cut off trade, but were actively hostile to Singapore's existence. To make matters worse, British forces withdrew from the island, taking with them 20% of the economy. Singapore seemed to be destined for underdevelopment, violence, and poverty.
I've spent a whole lifetime building this.
Kuan Yew is the founding father of Singapore and was also the Prime Minister of Singapore from 1959 to 1990. He is credited for ruling Singapore with an iron hand and transforming it from a poverty-stricken island it was in 1965 to a booming and powerful economy that Singapore is today. And Rwanda has been watching. Paul Kagame took notes from Kuan Yew's book. Let's look at some of the ways in which Rwanda is following in the footsteps of Singapore. 1. Abolition of tribalism and racism. When Kuan Yew came to power, the small island of Singapore had high racial and religious tensions. It was occupied by Chinese, Malays, and Indians. In order to bring about peace and harmony, Singapore adopted principles of multiculturalism and multiracialism. The state ensured that minorities were not mistreated, and in 1970, the state established the Presidential Council for Minority Rights to ensure that all bills passed by Parliament are not discriminatory against any racial group. Because of that, Singapore has 4 official languages: English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. All signs and radio announcements are made or written in all the 4 official languages. In the same light, Rwanda had 3 main tribes: Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. After genocide, the new government under Paul Kagame introduced a national unity and reconciliation program which fostered reconciliation between the survivors and the perpetrators. The government also passed a law against tribalism in 2001, where tribal identity in Rwanda was abolished. Everyone is just Rwandan, no tribes are allowed, and all Rwandans have equal rights and duties according to the constitution adopted in May of 2003. 2. Economic growth. In 1960, Singapore's economy was $700 million with a GDP per capita of $428. 2/3 of its population lived in poverty. Today, Singapore's economy is a whopping $396.9 billion with a GDP per capita of $72,000. Singapore is a global business hub with tech giants such as Google, Facebook setting their Asia Pacific headquarters in Singapore. It went from a third world country to a first world country in less than a lifetime. In 2000, the economy of Rwanda was $1.3 billion with a GDP per capita of $227. Today, that number is $11 billion with a GDP per capita of $834. Whereas Rwanda has made tremendous social and economic progress, they still fell short of their 2020 vision, which was to transform Rwanda into a middle-income economy by 2020. Rwanda has set Vision 2050, where it aspires to become an upper middle-income country by 2035, with a GDP per capita of over $4,000 and a high-income country by 2050, with a GDP per capita of over $12,000. 3. Direct foreign investment and ease of doing business. Singapore has no natural resources. It also lost access to any the day it gained its independence from Malaysia. Kuan Yew focused on attracting direct foreign investment and kept taxes low. Companies were given incentives like tax exemptions for 10 years. Kuan Yew banned unions to keep wages low, invested money into infrastructure, creating industrial zones, and went on to implement numerous policies that geared the economy towards exports. Mixed with Singapore's existing port, incredible geography, and business-friendly policies, many foreign businesses started to pour in. This contributed to the quick growth of Singapore's economy. By 1990, Singapore's economy had surpassed that of South Korea, Israel, and Portugal. Singapore would continue to implement hyper-capitalistic policies to increase investment by foreign companies, so much that today it is the second easiest country to do business in. World Bank uses Ease of Business Index to compare business regulation in 190 countries by comparing the following factors: ease of starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, registering property, getting credit, protecting minority investors, paying taxes, trading across borders, enforcing contracts, resolving insolvency, empowering workers, and contracting with the government. On this indicator, Singapore has a DB score of 86.2 out of 100, ranking as the second in the world. Rwanda has a DB score of 76.5, ranking as the 38th, not too great, but ranks as second on the African continent as the easiest country to do business in. According to Rwanda Development Board, Rwanda registered investments worth $2.6 billion in 2019, and foreign direct investments made 37% of that total. Rwanda saw a decrease of 47.1%, registering $1.3 billion of investment in 2020, and foreign direct investment made 51% of that total. The main sectors targeted by investors are real estate, construction, manufacturing, mining, infrastructure, among others. The major investing countries are Portugal, UK, India, and UAE. The government has made a significant effort in attracting more foreign direct investment through various measures, like a 0% corporate tax for any international company with its headquarters or regional offices in Rwanda. The government went ahead to create a one-stop center where registration of new businesses and information regarding investment can be accessed, which is the Rwanda Development Board. The Rwandan government aims to create 214,000 new jobs every year from investments and other employment opportunities for the citizens. 4. Zero tolerance towards corruption. Another indicator in which Singapore and Rwanda excel is the Corruption Perceptions Index. Singapore has a zero tolerance policy towards corruption, and it's for this reason that international companies invest in Singapore, because they do not need to bribe the government officials to obtain the necessary permits to do business. Singapore has been consistently ranked as the least corrupt Asian country on this index from 1995 to 2021. Worldwide, Singapore ranks as the fourth least corrupt country with a score of 85. Rwanda has a score of 53, which is not too great, but on the African continent it ranks among the top 5 least corrupt countries. Rwanda also ranks better than some of the big economies like China and India. 5. A competitive national airline. One of Singapore's largest companies is Singapore Airline, which ranks as the second best airline in the world after Qatar Airways. One can connect from Singapore to 5 different continents in a matter of hours. It is easy to underestimate the importance of having a globally competitive airline to establish a country as a business hub. Other business hubs such as Dubai and Doha wouldn't be as influential as they are without their national carriers. Rwanda has clearly noted this. The national airline, Rwanda Air, has grown from a tiny operation with a few jets to a significant intercontinental airline with brand new jets. It now flies all around Africa to Europe, Middle East, and Asia from its main base at Kigali International Airport. In addition, Rwanda, in partnership with foreign investors, is constructing a brand new 828 million airport known as Bugesera International Airport, which is expected to handle 1 million passengers and 1 million tons of cargo annually during its first phase. Once completed, it will be Rwanda's biggest and third international airport. 6. Affordable housing for the population. In the 1960s, 70% of the Singaporean population was living in slums with no water systems. Kuan Yew's administration constructed affordable housing but encouraged residents to buy apartments at low rates. Kuan Yew's administration went ahead to force residents to have a percentage of their income saved through the Central Provident Fund. Originally, the fund was for pensioners. However, Lee modified it, allowing citizens to spend it on housing. Slowly over the time, the amount forced to be saved was increased to 25% of every paycheck. Thanks to this mandatory saving, today 90% of Singaporeans own their own homes. More than 80% live in government-built residential units. The Rwandan government has taken note of this as well. It's aiming to increase urbanization rate to 35% in 2024, and it started an initiative, Rwanda Housing Authority, which seeks to provide housing solutions for low and middle income Rwandans throughout the country. A study conducted in Kigali city showed that 700,000 new units of affordable housing were needed in the city by 2028, and targets to increase those to 5.5 million units by 2050. The government will support its beneficiaries by giving them cheap and long-term loans through the Rwanda Housing Finance Project and subsidize the cost of the house to make it affordable. 7 is political stability. Political stability contributed highly to the success of Singapore. The World Bank ranks countries in terms of political stability and absence of violence and terrorism, and for Singapore, it ranks highly among the top 4 stable nations worldwide. This is the reason, along other factors like infrastructure, why big companies like Google and Facebook might choose to set up their Asian South Pacific offices in Singapore.
Welcome to Google Singapore.
Over a country like Taiwan, which ranks at number 49. Rwanda ranks at 94th position worldwide, which isn't too great. Since the RPF took over in 1994 after the genocide, Rwanda has been quite stable. Kagame took over power in 2000, and in 2017 a constitutional amendment was made which ended a 2-term limit for presidents, allowing him to potentially stay in power until 2034 if he runs for 1 7-year term and 2 5-year terms. Rwanda hasn't had a transition of power since 2000, and nobody can tell if the country will continue on the right path after Paul Kagame. 8. Environmental sustainability. Another factor to look at is climate change. Singapore has a Green Plan 2030, which will set aside about 200 hectares of land for natural parks. And Singapore will also plant 1 million more trees across the country. These are expected to absorb 78,000 tons of carbon dioxide, hence creating a clean air and cool shade. With more green spaces, there will be more wildlife, and by 2030, Singapore aspires to be a green, beautiful city in nature. Rwanda is following through with a green plan as well. As stated by the Rwanda Development Board, Rwanda is committed to become a green economy country and reduce 38% of emissions by 2030. In line with this mission, Rwanda is in the process of building the first green city on the African continent. It is a multi-billion-dollar project known as Green City Kigali, and its vision is to link affordable homes with climate resilient and green technologies. Green City Kigali is expected to cost $5 billion and span across 620 hectares of land. It will include 30,000 housing units and benefit an estimated 150,000 residents. It will be located 6 kilometers outside of Kigali, the capital. The city will have green buildings, renewable energy, wastewater and rainwater collection systems that will be installed in every house. This will reduce air pollution and environmental degradation. In addition to this, Kigali partnered with Gura Rides to provide carbon-free riding in the city. Bicycle station points are all around the city, and one can enjoy a green ride for 300 francs per hour. Rwanda went ahead to ban the single use of plastic in 2008, and Kigali also ranks as the cleanest city in Africa. Last but not least is democracy. Some of the ways in which Rwanda has achieved its growth has faced criticism, some arguing that Rwanda is under an authoritarian rule with some freedoms lacking. Rwanda is a state dominated by one political party, RPF, led by Paul Kagame, which has been the ruling party for the last 28 years. Crystal Ventures, an investment arm of the RPF and its members, has huge investments in the economy, ranging from construction, beverages, security services, among others. Critics argue that the company gets favors to win some government contracts against their competitors since it's affiliated to the ruling party. In the same manner, Singapore does not rank well on the democracy index. It scores 6.2 out of 10, ranking as the 66th in the world, and it's categorized as a flawed democracy, while Rwanda scores 3.10 out of 10 and it's categorized as an authoritarian state. To this, some people may say that look at the results. While it might be easy for some that live in other countries across the globe to criticize some of Rwanda's actions and economic progress, bear in mind that other nations' ideas and institutions have had hundreds of years to form and evolve. Rwanda's key economic targets are a GDP per capita of over $4,000 by 2035 and a GDP per capita of over $12,000 by 2050. Looking at the economic progress that Rwanda has made in the last 28 years, with a strong leadership, stable political environment, infrastructures in place, and a stable business environment, Rwanda is on the path to become the Singapore of Africa, though it still has a long journey ahead.